The man who walked through the gate of Sage Hollow Nursery that morning wore a faded flannel shirt, jeans worn thin at the knees, and boots caked with dried mud from somewhere else. He said his name was Hale Dorick. He said he'd done grounds work in Charleston, that he needed a place to sleep and honest work, that he'd take low wages and wouldn't complain about the heavy jobs, that he only wanted a chance. Nearly every word of it was a lie except the name, and even the name was only half true. Dorick was his mother's family name. His father's name was Brannick, and in Savannah, Georgia, nobody said that name any louder than they had to. Maren Kovalik did not know any of this, and her story began in the space between what was hidden and what was real. Hale Brannick controlled the Savannah waterfront. 38 companies filed under other people's names. 2 state senators who picked up before the second ring. They called him the Quiet Man, because in 15 years he had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. That morning he left the armored SUV 2 miles down the road and walked the rest on foot, so that when he stood at the nursery gate, he would look exactly like a man who owned nothing in this world. Maren looked the stranger over from behind a row of hydrangeas. She was 27. She was a widow. She was holding on alone to the small nursery her foster mother had left her, holding on in a way that, if she were honest, was really just losing slowly. She needed help badly. She also had money enough to pay one man for a few weeks and no more. So she said it plainly, because Maren Kovalik was a plain-spoken woman. "I'll be straight with you. I've got the shed out back. 3 meals a day, and $400 a week, and every week I have to open the books to find out whether I can cover it. If you want real wages, go down to the port. They say the Brannick companies pay their people well." The man standing in front of her did not blink. "I'd rather work for somebody who needs me," he said, "than for somebody who's just got money to spend." It was the truest thing he said all morning, and Maren had no way of knowing it. And so Maren Kovalik hired Hale Brannick to pull her weeds, prune her roses, and fix the irrigation line on the nursery she was about to lose. And Hale Brannick moved into the shed with a half-true name and a black phone hidden under a floorboard, to find the answer all his power had never been able to buy him. Whether anyone alive could care for that man, believing he had nothing to give and nothing to be afraid of. If you've ever wondered whether people care for who you are or for what you happen to have, leave a like so we know this story reached you. Share it with someone you believe would stay even if you had nothing left. And subscribe, so you don't miss the next story about people who find each other in the last place anyone would look. To understand why a man who could buy half the city would walk 2 miles along a dirt road to ask for a place to sleep in a barn, one must first know about a woman named Corinne Vess and about something Hale Brannick overheard through the crack of a door 7 years earlier. It happened 3 days before the engagement party. The great house was full of people coming and going that day: florists, workers raising the tent, relatives from the bride's side of the family. Hale went upstairs to the second floor to find a file, and stopped in the hallway when he heard Corinne's voice coming from the small sitting room. The door left open about the width of a hand. She was talking to her younger sister. Her voice was light and cheerful, the same voice he'd heard every morning for 2 years. And she said no, of course not. She'd never loved that man, and she didn't think she even knew what love was anymore. Then she went on, still in that same light and cheerful voice, saying that someone had arranged for her to meet him, that she hadn't arrived there by chance the way he still believed, and that none of it mattered now anyway. It was the last thing she said that remained with him. She said a woman could endure a great many things in exchange for a house whose door no one would ever dare knock on. Do you know how much it costs to never be afraid again? Hale Brannick stood in the hallway with the file still in his hand, and he didn't go in. He didn't push open the door. He didn't ask a single question. He turned back toward the stairs, walked past the florists building their arch, went outside, and sat in his car for an hour without starting the engine. 3 days later, there was no engagement party. Corinne Vess left the state that same week, without anyone touching a hair on her head, without losing a single dollar, and without ever hearing one word of blame from him. People in the organization whispered that the boss must have done something terrible. The truth was that he did nothing at all. He simply remained silent, and that silence followed him home, sat down beside him at the long table with 12 chairs, and stayed there for 7 years, because from that day forward, something broke in the way Hale Brannick heard other people speak. A woman smiled at him during a party, and he heard the question beneath her smile. A man gripped his hand firmly and praised him for being a decent man, and he heard the question beneath the handshake. People brought him gifts, asked him to be godfather to their children, remembered his birthday when he himself had forgotten it, and every time it happened, he heard the same question in his mind, the one no one ever spoke aloud, but that he knew was always there. Does this person want me? Or do they want what stands behind me? For 15 years, he'd built a name that made an entire city lower its voice whenever it was spoken, and that name stood between him and everyone he met, so thick that he could no longer see anyone through it. Then came a Saturday morning at the River Street Farmers Market, 3 months ago. Hale went there for a brief meeting, walking between two of his men, and everything happened exactly as it always did. The crowd parted before him without anyone giving a signal. Conversations softened as he approached, then swelled again behind him. A fruit seller saw him coming and hurriedly pressed a bag of oranges into his hand, waving away the money, and the hand doing the waving trembled. Hale accepted the oranges he didn't need, thanked the man in his calm, even voice, and kept walking. He'd lived inside that moving emptiness for so many years that he barely noticed it anymore. But that day, at the flower stall at the end of the row, a woman looked up. She was tying a bundle of rosemary. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to know he'd been seen, then lowered her eyes, retied the loosened string, and didn't look up again. No fear, no need, no interest. She didn't watch him as he passed. She didn't lower her voice, straighten her back, or do any of the things everyone else in that market had just done without being told. She was simply busy tying flowers, and a strange man had walked past her stall. Hale Brannock went home that day, sat down at the table with 12 chairs, ate dinner alone as he did every night, and couldn't drive that single second from his mind. He was accustomed to people looking at him and seeing a wall to hide behind, or a door to pass through, or something to stay far away from. He wasn't accustomed to someone looking at him and seeing nothing at all. 3 days later, he asked Augustine Drevek, whom everyone called Gus, about her. Gus was 61 years old, had worked for him for 11 years, and was the only man in the organization who dared answer a question with another question. He asked why. Hale told him to find out. A week later, Gus placed a sheet of paper on the desk and read aloud what he knew. Her name was Marin Kovalik. She was 27 years old. She'd been widowed for more than 2 years. Sage Hollow Nursery stood on the outskirts of the city, inherited from the foster mother who died. She owed the bank a sum that a nursery of that size could never hope to repay. 3 people had offered to buy the land over the past 18 months, each offer higher than the last, and all 3 times she'd refused. The final time, she'd answered with one brief sentence and closed the door. Gus folded the paper and added that there was nothing about this woman worth troubling the boss over. Hale didn't answer. He sat for a very long time, then asked Gus another question, one the older man would remember for the rest of his life. He asked whether Gus thought a man like him could still be needed by someone, if they didn't know who he was. Gus said he didn't know, and Hale Brannock said he didn't know either, but he was already 34 years old, and he didn't want to die without ever finding out. The plan came to him that night, and it must be called by its proper name. It was a lie. There is no other way to describe it, and there is no reason to excuse it. A grown man was preparing to enter the home of a woman who was slowly losing everything, borrow a name that was only half true, and allow her to believe something that wasn't. But it was the lie of a man who'd gone hungry for far too long for the feeling of being needed for himself rather than for his name, so hungry that he was willing to hide everything he possessed, just to see whether anything human remained beneath all that wealth. And the price of wanting to know, as he would later come to understand, wouldn't be paid by him. That first afternoon, Hale worked until the light began to fade, and he did far more than any newly arrived man needed to do. He cleared 2 beds of weeds that Marin had left untouched since spring, carried a stack of broken pots behind the barn, and began taking apart the jammed irrigation valve at the end of the rose rows. Marin came out once to look, then went back into the kitchen without saying anything. But close to 7 o'clock she stepped outside and called him in for dinner. Her kitchen was small, with a 4-chair wooden table pushed against the wall, and 2 plates had already been set upon it. Hale didn't notice that detail, because in his mind it didn't exist. He served himself, picked up his plate, thanked her, and turned toward the door. He did it with complete ease, without thinking, like a man who had suddenly remembered where he belonged. At his compound, and everywhere else he'd been in charge for the past 15 years, hired men ate where hired men ate, and he'd walked past the sight of men carrying their plates outside hundreds of times, without once stopping to consider what it meant. He'd taken 3 steps toward the door when Marin called sharply after him. "Mr. Doric." Hale turned around. She was standing beside the table with the ladle still in her hand, looking at him with the expression of someone who had just seen something placed where it didn't belong. "Where are you taking that plate?" He said he thought he'd eat out in the barn so he wouldn't be underfoot. Marin set down the ladle. Then she spoke in a calm, clipped voice that didn't rise even slightly, without making a speech, without offering a single word beyond what was necessary. "I grew up in 4 homes, and not one of them ever set a plate for me. Here, I set enough plates. Sit down." Hale Brannock stood still in the middle of the kitchen, holding his plate. He had sat in rooms where his silence alone was enough to make 3 grown men sweat. He had heard people speak to him in every manner imaginable, pleading, threatening, flattering, swearing their loyalty, and he'd taught himself how to let none of it touch him. There was no place prepared inside him to hold the words she had just spoken. He returned to the table and sat in the plastic chair across from her. Dinner that night was rice with stewed beans and fried eggs, a plate of sliced tomatoes in the middle of the table, and cold water poured from a pitcher kept in the refrigerator. Nothing on that table was worth more than $5. Hale ate everything on his plate, slowly, and as he ate, he realized she'd moved the second egg onto his plate without saying a word. He asked how many people she'd cooked this way for. Marin thought for a moment, then said not many. Her foster mother, when she was still alive. Her husband, when he was still here. A few seasonal workers during the busy months in earlier years, back when she could still afford to hire help. Then she added something she said as though it were the most obvious truth in the world. "But I've never sent anyone outside to eat alone." Hale asked why. Marin shrugged and said because she knew what it was like to eat alone, and because it didn't cost a penny more. Then she stood, carried the plates to the sink, and the conversation ended there, as simply as that. Because to her, it was nothing more than an ordinary matter that had been settled. She had no idea what she'd just said. Marin Kovalik wasn't showing kindness to a wealthy man in hopes of receiving something in return. She wasn't testing anyone. She didn't even believe she'd done anything worth remembering. She was simply the kind of person who set enough plates, just as she was the kind of person who watered her plants at 6 o'clock in the morning and paid the electric bill on time when she could still afford to pay it. And had anyone told her that those words would follow a man for the rest of his life, she would have thought they were joking. Hale washed his own plate before leaving. She told him to leave it there, and he said he was used to doing it, and even he no longer knew which lie of the day that one had been. That night, he lay on the folding cot in the barn, listening to the insects outside in the garden and the pipes groaning inside the walls, and he thought about the dining table in his great house. That table was long, made of walnut, with 12 chairs, custom built by a craftsman in Charleston to fit the proportions of the room. He'd eaten there nearly every night for the past 7 years, always at the head of the table, always alone, with a servant waiting near the kitchen door to clear everything away the moment he stood. Some nights he finished eating in 12 minutes. Some nights he never touched the food and simply sat there. The other 11 chairs were always polished clean and arranged perfectly, and he'd never noticed them until that night. He was lying in the barn of a woman carrying a burden of $180,000 on a borrowed folding cot after eating rice, beans, and eggs at a 4-chair table, and he realized it had been the fullest dinner table he'd sat at in 15 years. There had been exactly 2 people there. Those words spoken in the quiet kitchen lingered with him, carrying through everything that was about to unfold. The first 3 weeks at Sage Hollow passed in a way Hale Brannock had never prepared himself for. And it began with the simplest thing of all. Marin Kovalik didn't stand and watch him work. By 6 o'clock in the morning, she was already out in the garden wearing boots, her hair tied low, and by the time he reached her, she had already dragged half a coil of irrigation hose out of the shed. He took hold of the other end without either of them saying a word. At noon, she carried trays of seedlings beside him, instead of standing back and telling him where to put them, and when a tray was heavy, she said it was heavy, rather than pretending it wasn't. Hale had worked with many people in his life, but he'd never worked with anyone in this way, because where he came from, people didn't work beside him, they worked for him. And those 2 things were so different that it took him several days to recognize the difference. The matter of the roses was the first time he saw it clearly. The western row had been weak for several seasons, with thin stems and small blossoms, and Marin intended to replace all of them with a new variety she'd ordered the month before. She asked what he thought. He said he believed the soil there was waterlogged. Not that the roses were poor, that the drainage channel at the end of the row had been clogged with mud for a long time, and that if she replaced the plants without clearing that ditch, she would be standing in the same place with the same problem 2 seasons from now. When he finished speaking, he fell silent and waited for her to dismiss what he'd said. Where he came from, whenever he asked someone for an opinion, their answer was only a formality before he went ahead and did what he'd already decided to do. Marin didn't dismiss him. She walked the length of the rose row, knelt and pulled back the topsoil exactly where he'd pointed, then stood and said he was right. After that, she canceled half the order for new plants, and the 2 of them spent 2 full days digging out the drainage ditch, which stretched 20 meters. She dug her share. Not once did she ask him to dig it for her. Hale Brannock, a man who for the past 15 years needed only to speak a sentence before 4 men finished the job before he could turn his back, stood in mud up to his calves and realized that this was the first time in his life someone had listened to him and followed his advice because they believed he was right, not because they were afraid of him. The other small things kept coming in the same quiet way. She divided the water in the pitcher between 2 glasses, instead of handing him the whole pitcher and going to find another bottle for herself. During the noon break, she sat beside him in the shade beneath the metal awning instead of going inside where it was cooler. When there was only 1 serving of coffee left in the pot, she poured it into 2 cups rather than filling 1 cup for either of them, and she did it so quickly and naturally that it was clear she'd never imagined there could be any other way to divide it. He noticed that she didn't keep count. That was what unsettled him most during those weeks, though he couldn't yet name the feeling. His entire life had been spent among people who counted. Everyone counted, whether secretly or openly. They counted what they gave him and what they expected to receive in return, and he'd grown so accustomed to it that he no longer recognized how ugly it was. Marin didn't count, and it wasn't because she was generous. It was because that calculation had never existed in her mind at all. During the 3rd week, he finished repairing the irrigation system. It had been broken for 10 months, and Marin had watered 2 long beds by hand for all those months because the repairman had asked for $600 she didn't have. Hale spent 4 evenings tracing the blockage, replacing 2 sections of rotted pipe, and rebuilding every connection at the head of the row. That afternoon, he opened the valve, and water sprayed evenly across both beds. Marin stood watching for a long while. Then she turned to him and said plainly that he was good at this, that she'd called 2 men to examine the system, and both had told her the entire thing needed replacing. She didn't offer a long speech of gratitude. She simply said exactly what she thought, using no more words than necessary, and it was the truest praise Hale Brannock had received in 15 years, because it came from someone who had no reason to flatter him. He stood there surrounded by the sound of spraying water, and he understood that he'd been starving for something all those years without ever knowing what to call it. It wasn't love. It lay beneath even love. It was the ground from which love grew. It was being considered a person of value when he held nothing in his hands. Then came that night, sometime around the 3rd week, when Hale couldn't sleep. He lay on the folding cot listening to the pipes inside the wall, thinking about the work waiting for him at the harbor, thinking about Gus, thinking about what he was doing to the woman sleeping in the house 30 meters away, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, he got up and sat on the back porch steps. The night wasn't cold. He'd been sitting there for about 10 minutes when he heard the screen door open behind him. Marin came outside holding 2 cups. She handed him 1 cup of hot tea, then sat at the other end of the step, about 1 meter away. Happy didn't ask why he was awake. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She didn't say anything at all. The 2 of them sat there for 40 minutes in the darkness, listening to the insects in the garden. And Hale Brannock drank every drop of tea in his cup without speaking, because he didn't know what to say in a moment when no one was asking anything of him. Close to 3 o'clock, Marin stood, picked up her empty cup, and said one thing before going back inside. She said she simply didn't like leaving people to sit alone in the dark. Then the screen door closed, and he remained there for a long time afterward. Hale Brannock sat there in the silence, understanding exactly what had just happened. Hale Brannock was a man the entire city of Savannah avoided. People stepped aside when he passed, lowered their voices when they spoke his name, and pressed oranges into his hands with trembling fingers because they wanted him away from their stall as quickly as possible. In 15 years, no one had ever sat beside him in the darkness without wanting something from him, without fearing him, and without asking him a single question. It was the greatest gift he'd ever received, and it hadn't cost the person who gave it a single cent. The test he'd devised, The question he'd left his entire life behind to answer had already been answered by exactly 40 minutes of silence that night, but Hale Brannick didn't recognize it. He would remain there for many more weeks, searching for something he'd already held in his hands, and during that time, the price he'd never thought to calculate would begin to accumulate. By the 4th week, Hale's hands began to suffer. The western rose rows were due for pruning, and there was no way to prune roses without meeting the thorns, especially when the person doing the work had no gloves. He had gloves, of course he did. At home, he had an entire cabinet filled with protective equipment, better than anything sold at the supply store out on the main road. But the man called Hale Dorick owned nothing except his 2 hands, and he had placed himself inside that role, so he had to endure it. He worked for 3 days in a row, and by the 3rd day, the backs of his hands were covered in scratches, some already scabbed over, others still fresh. He said nothing. He didn't think anyone had noticed, but that evening, when he washed his hands at the basin outside the porch before going in for dinner, he turned and saw Marin standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at his hands. She didn't say anything. She simply went back inside. After dinner had been cleared away, she disappeared into the back room for a moment, then returned and placed a pair of faded leather gloves on the table. They were soft, old, and worn, but still in good condition. Along one cuff was a line of hand stitching in a different color of thread, where the seam must once have split open. She pushed them toward him. She said they would fit his hands, and that sitting in a drawer, they weren't helping anyone. Hale picked them up. The gloves were lighter than he expected, and the leather inside had worn itself into the shape of another hand, one that wasn't his. He asked who they had belonged to. Marin paused for a single beat. Only one. A silence long enough to tell him there was something behind it, but not long enough to invite another question. Then she said they had belonged to someone in her family who was gone now. She said it in the voice of someone closing a subject, not opening one. Hale held the gloves, thanked her, and went back out to the barn. He asked nothing more. She said nothing more. He held the gloves, feeling the worn leather against his skin, unaware of the history stitched into their seams. That Sunday, the nursery had visitors. Since the previous spring, Marin had been allowing small school groups to come and plant things. She charged a few dollars per child, calling it a little extra money for fertilizer, and the visit had been scheduled long ago, so she kept the appointment. At 9 o'clock that morning, a small yellow school bus stopped outside the gate, and an elementary school class spilled out, accompanied by 2 teachers and 4 parents, who counted heads and arranged the children into a line. They were led into the backyard, where Marin had already set up 2 rows of long tables, laid out plastic pots, filled each tray with soil, and prepared a basket full of sunflower seeds. She explained each step in a voice louder than usual, while Hale stood at the far end of the yard, shoveling more soil into the trays whenever they ran low. That entire morning, the backyard was filled with laughter. The children scattered soil everywhere. Some planted their seeds too deeply. Others poured so much water into their pots that it spilled across the tables, while the parents walked from child to child, wiping small hands with paper towels. At the end, each child was allowed to write their name on the side of the pot with a marker before taking it home. And that part took longer than the planting itself, because some children finished writing and then decided they wanted their names larger. One little girl, about 7 years old, with her hair braided on both sides, struggled because she was trying to hold both a trowel and a marker at the same time. She looked around, saw the tall man shoveling soil nearby, held out the plastic trowel, and called to him. "Mr. Gardner, can you hold this for me?" Hale bent down, took the plastic trowel, and held it while she carefully wrote her name along the side of the pot. When she reached out for it again, he gave it back, and she said thank you before running away. That brief interaction was the most important thing that happened all morning, even though no one saw it. For 15 years, every name people used for Hale Brannick had carried something with it. They called him Mr. Brannick in the careful voice of someone afraid of saying the wrong thing. They called him Sir, Boss, Chief, and in every one of those words, there was a distance that had been measured and guarded. No one had ever called him by a name that held not even the smallest grain of fear. Mr. Gardner. He stood there with the plastic trowel in his hand, in the middle of a sunlit yard filled with children's voices, and he didn't know what to do with the feeling rising inside his chest. Then he lifted his eyes and looked ahead, beyond the fence, toward the dirt road leading into the nursery. A gray sedan was parked there, 70 or 80 meters from the gate, beneath the shade of a tree. The windows were closed. The engine was still running. It was parked in a place where no one would stop merely to check directions, and it sat in the particular manner Hale Brannock had seen several hundred times during his 15 years in his line of work. He went still. He didn't walk toward it. He didn't call anyone. He simply watched it for about 3 minutes, and the car remained motionless for about 3 minutes, then backed up, turned around, and drove away along the dirt road. No one else in the yard noticed it. Marin was bent down, showing a child how to press a seed into the soil. The 2 teachers were counting the pots again. The 4 parents were lining up the children to wash their hands. Hale said nothing to anyone about the car. Not that day, and not in the days that followed, because mentioning it would mean explaining how a gardener knew how to read a car parked by the road. By 11 o'clock, the lesson was over. The children climbed back onto the bus, each carrying a pot with their name written on it in marker, and they waved through the windows as the bus pulled away. The backyard was left scattered with soil, damp paper towels, and sunlight. Marin stood with her hands on her hips, watching the yellow bus disappear around the bend, then turned to him and said the morning had brought in $32, enough to buy fertilizer for 2 beds. She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile since the day he arrived, and Hale Brannock stood there smiling with her, while in his mind, the gray sedan remained parked beneath the tree and refused to leave. The $32 from that Sunday morning was enough to buy fertilizer for 2 beds, and the following Tuesday, Marin drove him in the old pickup truck to the agricultural supply store out on the main road to purchase it. She also needed more plant ties, a roll of shade cloth, and several new seedling trays, and she had already written everything down on a sheet of paper, with the price beside each item and the total added at the bottom, because that was how a woman shopped when she could spend exactly what she had in her wallet and not a cent more. The store was crowded. People stood in line at the checkout counter. Carts piled high with bags of fertilizer blocked the aisles, and Hale pushed their cart behind her, loading each bag onto it like a hired man accompanying his employer. He was waiting near the counter, while Marin went farther inside to ask about the roll of shade cloth, when 2 men approached. Both were somewhere in their 40s, with their shirts tucked into their pants and clean shoes. The kind of men who came to an agricultural supply store to buy grass seed for the lawn in front of their homes, not fertilizer for 2 flower beds. One of them owned several dozen acres across the road, and the other had come with him. They looked Hale up and down, taking in the faded flannel shirt, the boots, and the scratches on his hands that hadn't yet fully healed, and the first man turned to the second and spoke just loudly enough to be heard. He said no one knew what sort of stray the Kovalik girl had dragged home to live on her land now, then added that it made sense, because a woman alone took whatever she could get. Both men laughed, the brief laugh of people who had just said something they believed was harmless. Hale Brannock stood still. Not a single muscle moved in his face. In the past 15 years, no one had ever spoken such words to him or about him within his hearing, and had anyone done so, the person who said them would have understood his mistake before the week was over. Hale stood there calculating for exactly 3 seconds, not what he should do to those 2 men, but how a gardener named Hale Dorick was permitted to react, and the answer was that he wasn't permitted to react at all. He lowered his head and straightened the bags of fertilizer on the cart. But Marin had already come back. She stood about 4 steps away, holding the roll of shade cloth in her arms, and she had heard everything. She set the roll on the cart, walked directly toward the 2 men, and lifted her chin. She didn't raise her voice. Her words were clear and sharp, and everyone nearby could hear them. She said this man had done more decent work on her land in 1 month than the 2 of them had done in their entire lives. She said she would appreciate it if they kept their opinions about her worker behind their teeth. Then she stood there without turning away, waiting to see whether either man wished to say anything more. Neither of them did. The first man flushed all the way to his neck, muttered something no one could make out, and then both men pushed their cart around to the next aisle and remained there for a very long time, far longer than anyone needed to choose grass seed. Marin returned to their cart, arranged the roll of shade cloth neatly, and told Hale that the large seedling trays were out of stock, so she had taken the smaller size instead. She said it in the same voice she would have used if the previous 30 seconds had never happened. On the drive home, the pickup moved slowly along the dirt road. Marin remained silent for a while before speaking. She said she was sorry for speaking on his behalf. She said she hadn't meant to suggest that he couldn't speak for himself, only that she had heard the words first, and she had a habit of speaking the moment she heard something instead of holding it in. and some people didn't like having someone else stand up for them that way. She asked whether it had bothered him. Hale looked out the window for a moment, then said no, only one word. But his voice sounded slightly different when he said it. Different in the way a man's voice changes when he is struggling to keep it steady. And Marin was busy watching the potholes ahead, so she didn't notice. She only nodded, and for her, the matter ended there. For him, it didn't. He thought back over everything he had received in 15 years. People had praised him, they had thanked him, offered him the seat at the head of the room, remembered his name, remembered his birthday, and even remembered how he took his coffee. Powerful men had gripped his hand firmly and called him their friend. An entire city had respected him so deeply that people lowered their voices when they spoke his name in restaurants. But every one of those things had come from people who feared him, needed him, or wanted what he possessed. And every time he received one of them, he heard the question beneath it, the question that had lived in his mind for 7 years, ever since he had stood outside that partly open door. Not once in those 15 years had anyone ever defended him. People didn't defend someone they feared. They didn't need to defend someone more powerful than themselves. Defending someone was what people did only for a person they believed deserved defending, when that person couldn't protect himself. And that was something no amount of money or power he possessed could ever buy. That day, in the middle of an agricultural supply store, a woman who owed the bank $180,000 had defended the wealthiest man in the Savannah Harbor district against 2 men who, had they known who he truly was, wouldn't have dared lift their eyes to meet his. She had done it for a man she believed had nothing at all. And sitting in that old pickup truck that evening, Hale Brannick, 34 years old, finally learned to distinguish between 2 things he had mistaken for one his entire life. To be respected was to be taken into account. To be cared for was to have someone stand on your side when there was nothing in it for them. At the end of that week, Marin received a shipment of ornamental plants she had ordered before the spring season. 36 mature corn plants and imperial philodendrons, the kind sold to offices and restaurants downtown, and at that time, they were the most valuable merchandise in the entire nursery. She arranged all of them in the covered yard behind the barn, watered them until the soil was damp, and that evening she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, working through the figures on a sheet of paper. She told him, in a voice as light as though she were talking about the weather, that if she sold the entire shipment within the month, she could finish paying the electric bill for that quarter and still have a little left over. After saying it, she folded the paper, tucked it into the pocket of her apron, and Hale watched the gesture without speaking. The following night, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, he woke to a very faint sound. He lay still in the barn, his eyes open in the darkness, and listened. The sound came again. It was metal cutting into metal, broken and careful. The sound of someone who knew what he was doing and didn't want anyone to hear. It came from the western stretch of fence, the most concealed section, the place that couldn't be seen from the house because the rose rows blocked the view. Hale sat up. He didn't turn on a light. He pulled on his boots and went out through the back door of the barn, moving in a way no gardener from Charleston would know how to move, staying on the soft earth along the edges of the beds instead of walking on the gravel path, setting each foot down heel first. There were 2 men in the yard. Hale stood behind the corner of the barn and looked out, counting 2 shadows, one carrying the plants and the other standing by the cut fence to receive them as they were passed through. They had already moved 5 or 6 pots as far as the fence. A vehicle was parked on the dirt road outside, its engine off and its lights dark. What happened next was brief and fast, veiled in the dark because Marin Kovalik herself didn't see it. There were footsteps on gravel. There was a shout cut off halfway through. There was the sound of a collision, then the sound of someone falling into the stack of plastic pots beside the wall, sending the entire stack crashing to the ground. Someone spoke a very short sentence in a low voice, but from inside the house, the words couldn't be made out. Then came the sound of 2 men running, the wire mesh fence being ripped open, a car door slamming in haste, and an engine fading into the distance along the dirt road. The entire thing lasted less than a minute. Marin switched on the bedroom light, grabbed a flashlight, and ran outside through the kitchen door, barefoot, her heart pounding. She swept the beam across the yard. The stack of plastic pots lay scattered everywhere. 6 plants had been knocked over near the fence. Their soil spilled across the ground. A square section had been cut from the western fence, large enough for a person to crawl through. And in the middle of the yard stood Hale Dorick, empty-handed, dressed in a t-shirt and long pants, breathing as evenly as though he'd merely walked over from the barn and hadn't done anything else. He looked at her and spoke in the same calm voice he used for everything. He said they were gone. He said he would repair the fence in the morning. Maren stood there with the flashlight trembling slightly in her hand and asked whether he was hurt. He said no. She asked who they were. He said he didn't know, probably people from nearby who had seen the new shipment arrive. She asked whether he had been afraid. Hale paused for a beat, then said no. Just one word, with no explanation, no account of what had happened, no question about whether she was all right. None of the things a person who had just confronted two strangers in the yard at 2 o'clock in the morning would normally do. Maren looked at him. She looked a little longer than usual, long enough for the flashlight in her hand to lower until its beam rested on the ground, and something in her mind shifted out of place, though she couldn't yet name it. She had spent her whole life around men who worked with their hands. Her foster father, her husband, the seasonal workers. She knew what men were like after something such as this. They breathed hard. They swore. They told the story of what had happened 3 or 4 times, adding another detail each time, because that was how people emptied fear from their bodies. The man standing before her now had nothing to empty. He stood in the middle of the yard at 2 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by fallen pots, and he was as calm as he had been while eating rice, beans, and eggs at her kitchen table. She said they should go back to sleep and deal with it in the morning. He said, "All right." She went inside, and it took her a very long time to fall asleep. The next morning, she didn't mention what had happened during the night. Neither did Hale. He rose early, went to the damaged section of fence, cut away the ruined mesh, fitted a new piece into place, and secured it with wire, working so neatly that it seemed he'd repaired fences 100 times before. Maren made coffee and carried a cup out to him, but afterward, she remained on the porch and watched him. When the repair was finished, he didn't come back inside. He began walking south along the fence, slowly, his eyes lowered toward the base, occasionally stopping to press a post with his hand before continuing. He walked the entire southern boundary, turned east, followed the eastern side to its end, then circled north. He walked all 4 sides of the property. He stopped at 2 places, where someone standing on the road could see directly into the backyard, remained there for a long while, then moved on. It took him nearly 40 minutes to complete the circuit, and during those 40 minutes, he didn't pull a single weed, water a single pot, or do anything that belonged to the work of a gardener. Maren stood on the porch and watched him make the entire round, the coffee cooling slowly in her hand. She didn't ask. She went back inside, washed the cup, and began her morning work as she did every day. But something had just been placed inside a corner of her mind, somewhere she hadn't yet opened and hadn't yet named. It was the first crack in the shell Hale Brannock had worn from the day he walked through the gate of Sage Hollow Nursery. He didn't know he'd allowed it to crack. And later, when everything had broken apart, Maren would remember this exact morning. The man walking slowly along all 4 sides of the fence like someone inspecting the perimeter of something he was responsible for protecting. There was a loose floorboard in the corner of the barn, against the wall behind the folding cot, and beneath that board Hale Brannock kept a black telephone. Every night, after the lights had gone out across the nursery and the main house had fallen completely silent, he took it out and called Gus Dravek for exactly 30 minutes. It was the only connection he still had to the 15 years of life he had left behind. 30 minutes to hear what was happening at the harbor, to make 3 or 4 decisions, to approve aloud the things he would normally approve with nothing more than a look. Gus read each item in the order they had always used. Hale listened, occasionally spoke a single word, and the organization continued to run. But by the 5th week, something in Gus's voice began to change. He still read every item, still waited for Hale's answers, but at the end of each call, he no longer hung up immediately as he always had before. One night, he spoke plainly. He said 5 weeks was too long. He said he had managed for 3 weeks, struggled through 4, but by the 5th week, people had begun asking questions, and they weren't asking him, they were asking one another. Then he said something Hale would remember many times in the years that followed. He said people feared a man, but they couldn't go on fearing an empty chair forever. Hale listened to everything, sitting on the folding cot in the darkness of the barn, then told Gus to keep doing what he was doing. Gus remained silent for a long time before asking how much longer Hale intended to stay there. Hale said he didn't know. It was the most truthful answer he had given during those 5 weeks, and it was also the worst, because when a man in his position said he didn't know, It meant something else had begun making the decision for him. One night, Maren saw the light. She woke close to 1 o'clock in the morning to get a drink of water, passed the kitchen window, and saw a faint blue glow shining through the crack of the barn door. It disappeared, then appeared again. She stood there watching for a while. She couldn't hear his voice. The barn was 30 meters from the main house, and he spoke very quietly, but she could see his shadow moving across the wall whenever he shifted where he sat. That man was awake at 1 o'clock in the morning, speaking to someone. Maren stood at the kitchen window and told herself a story. She thought he had a family somewhere, perhaps an elderly mother in Charleston, perhaps children he wasn't allowed to be near, perhaps a former wife, perhaps someone who was ill. She thought that was why a man in his 30s was wandering from place to place, asking for work at a nursery on the verge of collapse, why he accepted $400 a week without bargaining, why there were afternoons when he sat motionless between 2 rows of plants before rising and returning to work. She thought he was sending money home to someone. She thought he made his calls at night because he didn't want her to see him during the day. And she decided not to ask, because Maren Kovalik had grown up in 4 houses that weren't her own, and she understood very well what it felt like to be questioned about things one didn't wish to tell. She finished her glass of water and went back to bed. The following morning, when Hale opened the barn door at 6 o'clock, there was a plate waiting on the step. On it were 2 egg sandwiches and a banana, and beside it sat a cup of coffee that was still warm, covered with a small saucer to keep it from cooling. There was no note. No one was standing there waiting to be thanked. The sound of running water came from the kitchen, which meant she had been awake for some time and had already finished washing the dishes. Hale Brannock stood in the barn doorway and looked at the plate on the step for a long while. He wasn't a man who had difficulty understanding what other people meant. He knew immediately what had happened. She had seen the light the night before, and in her mind she had created a man with a family far away, with private sorrows, with a worthy reason for being awake at 1 o'clock in the morning, and now she was taking care of that man. She was giving an extra breakfast to a story she had invented herself. Using money she counted coin by coin on the sheet of paper in her apron pocket. And the story she had invented was far kinder than the truth. The truth was that the man in the barn the night before had been running 38 companies through a telephone hidden beneath the floorboards. Listening to his second-in-command report matters that, had she known even 1/10 of them, would have made her refuse to ever let him through her gate again. The truth was that he wasn't sending money to anyone, because there was no one to send it to. The truth was that he was there to test her, and she didn't know it. Hale picked up the plate, and for one moment, he intended to walk straight into the kitchen and tell her everything right then, while nothing had yet been ruined. But he didn't. He sat down on the step, ate both sandwiches, drank all the coffee, then carried the plate into the kitchen and thanked her, and she merely nodded without looking up. That evening, Gus called earlier than usual. He said there was a problem. He said strangers had been asking questions around the harbor for the past several days. Not police officers, not reporters, but the kind of men who asked very carefully, questioning the dock workers at Pier 3 and the cashier at the restaurant Hale's men often visited. They were all asking the same thing. They wanted to know whether anyone had seen the boss lately. Gus said he didn't like it. He asked whether he should send someone to investigate. Hale sat in the darkness of the barn, and what he saw in his mind was the plate of sandwiches on the step, the cup of coffee covered to keep it warm, and a woman believing in a kind story she had invented for herself. He told Gus not to worry, that the matter was still under control, and that Gus should leave it to him. Gus said yes, and ended the call. It was the last time Hale Brannock would ever tell someone not to worry about something they had reason to fear, and he wouldn't be the one who paid the price for saying it. The man named Neil Poacher came to Sage Hollow Nursery on a Thursday afternoon, driving a clean car that he parked directly in the middle of the entrance without turning off the engine. He was about 45 years old and carried a thin briefcase, and instead of walking around to the backyard to look for the owner, he stood at the head of the path and called her name. Maren came out from between the greenhouses with pruning shears still in her hand. Hale was tying up a climbing trellis about 20 meters away, and he didn't stop working, but he heard every word. Poacher said he represented the party holding her loan, that he had sent 2 letters through the mail and received no response, so that day he had brought one in person. He took an envelope from his briefcase and held it out to her. Then he added, in the voice of a man who had spoken those same words in dozens of other yards, that he was only doing his job and hoped she would read it carefully. Then he got back into his car and left. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. Marin carried the envelope into the kitchen. She sat down in her chair at the 4-chair table, opened it, and began to read. Hale came in behind her and stood in the kitchen doorway, and he watched the color drain from her face. There was no sound at all. She read the first page to the end, turned to the second, finished that one, then sat motionless for about 10 seconds, staring down at the tabletop. The letter said that the old loan in her husband's name had reached its final repayment date, that the total amount due was $180,000, that she had 45 days from the date printed on the letter to pay the balance in full, and that if she failed to do so, the holder of the loan would begin foreclosure proceedings against the collateral, which included the entire property and every structure standing on the land at Sage Hollow. Marin folded the letter in half, then in quarters, and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. Then she stood, picked up the pruning shears, walked toward the kitchen door, and as she passed Hale, she said the eastern hydrangea bed hadn't been watered yet, and she needed to finish it before the sun grew too strong. She went out into the garden. She opened the valve, pulled out the hose, and watered the entire hydrangea bed, all 18 meters of it, from one end to the other, slowly and evenly, exactly as she had watered it every afternoon for the past 2.5 years. In that quiet moment, the entire story rested on the image of a woman standing alone, watering her flowers. Marin Kovalyk didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She didn't sit down and bury her face in her hands. She had just finished reading a piece of paper, telling her that in 45 days she would lose the last thing remaining from her entire life. And the first thing she did afterward was go outside and finish watering the flowers, because the heat was coming. That was how she had faced everything since she was 6 years old. No one had taught her to do it. She had taught herself in 4 houses that weren't her own, and it was the only thing that had never betrayed her. Dinner that evening was quieter than usual. When they had finished eating and Hale rose to return to the barn, Marin called him back. She spoke in a light voice, almost cheerfully, the voice people used when they wanted to deliver bad news without making anyone uncomfortable. She said she probably wouldn't be able to pay him the following month. She said she would try to finish paying him for the current month, but after that, she couldn't promise anything, and she thought he should begin looking for another place now, instead of waiting until there was nothing left for him to leave. She said the harbor was always hiring, and he was a good worker, so anyone who employed him would benefit. Hale stood in the kitchen doorway and said he was staying. Marin shook her head. She said she had nothing with which to keep him there. She said it calmly, as though it were a fact she had examined carefully, that she had no money, no contract, and no promise she could offer anyone, and that a man couldn't remain in a place merely because it gave him 3 meals a day. Hale looked at her for a moment, then said she had kept him there since the first night. Marin frowned. She asked what he meant. He said it was nothing, wished her good night, and walked outside. She remained alone in the kitchen with those words and didn't understand them, and she wouldn't understand them until much later, after she learned who the man who had spoken them truly was. Hale didn't sleep that night. He lay on the folding cot in the barn and thought about the letter inside her apron pocket. He thought about how $180,000 was an amount he could transfer in less time than it had taken her to finish watering the hydrangeas that afternoon. He thought about how a single telephone call lasting 30 seconds could make all the fear resting inside that apron pocket disappear, and the woman in the house would sleep peacefully that night and every night afterward. Then he thought about 7 years earlier, about the partly open door and Corinne Vess's light, cheerful voice saying that a woman could endure a great many things in exchange for a house whose door no one would ever dare knock on. He lay between those two things for several hours. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, he lifted the loose floorboard, took out the black telephone, and called Gus Stravik. Gus answered after the second ring, as he always did. Hale didn't ask how he was. He didn't wait for Gus to begin reading the report. He spoke one sentence. He said, "Neil Poacher. Find out what he's afraid of." Gus paused for a beat, then said yes, and ended the call. It was the first order Hale Brannick had given since walking through the gates. For 5 weeks, he had lived as a man with no power at all, and that night, because of a woman who had stood watering flowers after reading a collection letter, he reached out and touched the thing he had tried to put away. He did it with good intentions. He did it because he couldn't bear to watch her suffer. And in 15 years of holding power over the Savannah Harbor District, with all the orders he had ever given, it would be the only command he regretted until the end of his life. Gus Stravik called back 3 days later, and he didn't begin with Neil Poacher. He said he would get to Poacher afterward, but first, there was something he believed Hale needed to hear. He said that while tracing the loan to discover who truly held it, he had been forced to reopen the entire original file from the day it was signed, and he had found something he didn't understand. He said the $180,000 hadn't been withdrawn all at once. It had been taken out gradually over 2 years, every month, in nearly equal amounts, with slight differences from one month to the next, but never very large ones. Hale sat up on the folding cot. He asked where the money had gone. Gus said that was exactly what he couldn't understand. He said he had investigated the 3 usual possibilities first. There were no gambling tables. No casino in Savannah or Charleston had the name Brant Whitlow in its records, and Gus knew that with certainty because their people had a presence in nearly every one of those places. There had been no investment, no company, and no purchase agreement of any kind in Whitlow's name during the final 2 years of his life. And there had been no other woman, no second rented apartment, no account receiving regular payments under a woman's name other than his wife's. Every dollar, month after month, had gone into a single account. The account holder's name was Ottilie Rausch, 66 years old, with no criminal record, no debts, and an occupation listed as beekeeping and selling honey. Her address was exactly 300 meters from Sage Hollow Nursery. Hale remained silent in the darkness of the barn for a long time after Gus finished speaking. He knew the house. He passed it every time he went out to the main road, a small wooden home painted pale blue, with a low fence, several beehives arranged behind it, and a hand-painted wooden sign hanging at the gate that said honey for sale. He had seen the elderly woman twice, once cutting the grass in the front yard and once walking out to the mailbox. The woman who sold honey from that little house had received $180,000 from Marin Kovalik's late husband over the course of 24 months. On Saturday morning, Marin left to deliver plants to a restaurant downtown and said she would be back by noon. Hale waited until the pickup disappeared down the dirt road, then walked the 300 meters to Ottilie Rausch's house. She came out to open the gate, looked at him, and said she knew who he was, that he worked at Marin's place. She invited him inside. The kitchen smelled of beeswax. She poured him a cup of tea, set it before him, then sat across from him and looked at him. She looked for a long time. She looked at him in the way old people look when they are in no hurry and have lived long enough not to feel ashamed of meeting another person's eyes, and while she watched him, Hale felt something strange move along his spine, a feeling he hadn't experienced once during his 5 weeks at Sage Hollow. He had the sense that this woman knew he wasn't a gardener. He began carefully. He said he knew this wasn't his concern, but Marin was in trouble. There was an old debt in her husband's name, and she could lose the nursery in less than 6 weeks. He said he was trying to understand what had happened, so he could see whether there was any way to help her. Then he said it plainly, that he knew Brant Whitlow's money had been transferred into her account regularly over the course of 2 years. Ottilie didn't flinch. She didn't ask how he knew that, though it should have been the first question asked by anyone sitting in her place, and the fact that she didn't ask was what made Hale sit a little straighter. She simply placed both hands on the table, studied him for another moment, and spoke. She said she had made a promise to a dead man. She said if he wanted to know, he could go ask that man. Hale said she knew that wasn't possible. Ottilie nodded and said she knew. He remained there for another 20 minutes. He asked again in 3 or 4 different ways, gently at times, directly at others, and he did it with the same skill he had used for 15 years, to draw from people's mouths the things they had never intended to say. There was nothing to be drawn from this elderly woman who sold honey. She didn't evade him, didn't lie, and didn't change the subject. She simply refused to say another word about it, and each time he asked, she poured more tea into his cup. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him all the way to the gate, and there she said one more thing to him, the only thing she said beyond her refusal. She said she didn't yet know whether he was a good man or a bad one, but he was living in that girl's home, so he had better treat her kindly. Then she closed the gate. His suspicion leaned in the only direction his past had ever taught him. He had spent 15 years in a world where money flowing steadily each month into an obscure account always meant one of 3 things, and all 3 were dirty. People paid for silence. People paid to hide a mistake. People paid for something that would end their life as they knew it if their wife ever found out. He couldn't imagine a 4th reason, because in his world, no 4th reason existed, and so, from that Saturday morning forward, Hale Brannick began to believe that Marin Kovalik's late husband had deceived her. He believed she was carrying $180,000 in debt to pay for some filthy secret belonging to a man who had been in the ground for 2.5 years and was no longer there to answer for it. He was wrong. He was completely wrong. So wrong that when he eventually learned the truth, he would have to sit down. But he wouldn't know he was wrong until everything had already fallen apart. And throughout the time before that happened, whenever he passed the kitchen cabinet in Marin's house, the one where a small framed photograph rested at an angle beside the tea tin, he would look at the face of the man in that photograph with an expression he had no right to wear. The 45 days began counting down from the afternoon. Neil Potcher parked his car in the middle of the entrance, and Marin Kovalik counted them in her own way, which meant cutting things away. The first thing she did was call the telephone company and reduce her plan to the lowest possible level, removing all mobile data and keeping only calls. She did it at the kitchen table one morning, speaking calmly, thanking the woman on the other end of the line before hanging up, and she saved $31 a month. Hale stood outside on the porch and heard the entire call. $31. He stood there, and in his mind appeared the amount he paid every month, merely to maintain 2 cars he almost never used. The second thing was the small tiller. It was old and difficult to start, but it still ran, and Marin still used it to turn the soil at the beginning of each growing season. She wrote a sale notice by hand in large letters, including the price and her telephone number, then carried it to the utility pole at the end of the dirt road and fastened it there with clear tape so the wind wouldn't tear it away. Hale walked out with her because she had asked him to hold the ladder. He stood below, steadying it while a woman climbed up to post an advertisement selling her own tiller. And he knew exactly what the machine was worth, and he knew that amount wouldn't cover even 1 month of interest on the debt. She climbed down, brushed the dust from her hands onto her pants, and said every dollar helped. Then came the meals. That week, less food began appearing on the table. For 3 nights in a row, there was only rice, stewed beans, and eggs, nothing else, and Hale noticed that she had bought far less meat on her most recent trip to the market. On the 3rd evening, when she served dinner, there was exactly 1 small portion of braised meat left over from the day before. Without saying anything, she placed it on his plate. Hale moved it back to hers. She returned it to his plate and said he did heavier work, so he needed it more. He was about to move it back a 3rd time when she turned away to get the pitcher of water, and when she sat down again, she ate rice and beans without looking toward his plate. He sat there before that piece of meat and couldn't swallow. A silent, painful truth filled that small kitchen. The man sitting in the plastic chair across from her could erase every fear this woman carried, with a telephone call lasting 30 seconds. He didn't need to consult anyone. He didn't need anyone's permission. He only had to lift the loose floorboard in the barn, press 2 buttons, and speak 1 sentence to Gus Dravec. And before morning, the debt of $180,000 would no longer exist. To him, that amount meant scarcely more than $31 a month meant to her. He could buy the entire property across the road for her if she wanted it. He could hire 10 workers for her and pay their wages for the rest of her life without ever looking at the books. And he sat there eating rice and beans, watching her place the last piece of meat on his plate, and did nothing. Every time he tried to speak, something stopped him. It wasn't calculation. It was a voice, the light, cheerful voice of a woman speaking to her younger sister behind a partly open door 7 years earlier, the voice saying that a woman could endure a great many things in exchange for a house whose door no one would ever dare knock on. 7 years had passed, and that voice remained perfectly intact inside his mind, not faded in the slightest, and it always asked him the same question at the exact moments when he was about to trust someone. If he paid this debt, he would never know. He would never know whom the woman sitting across from him was thanking. Hale Doric or $180,000. He would have her gratitude, and he already had the gratitude of an entire city, and it had never made him feel even slightly less alone. What he wanted couldn't be bought by paying someone else's debt. What he wanted was to know how she would treat him when she believed he had nothing at all, and he already knew. He had known since the night she carried 2 cups of tea outside and sat beside him on the porch, but he still hadn't dared admit that he knew, because admitting it meant telling her the truth, and telling her the truth meant everything would change in a way he couldn't control. So he remained silent, and each day of silence cost more than the day before. It was the most painful thing Hale Brannock had ever endured in all the years he had lived the life he lived. He had endured many things. He had sat in rooms where one wrong calculation would cost him everything. He had lost people, lost money, and gone entire weeks without sleeping. But he had never been forced to sit still and watch someone he could save in 30 seconds reduce her telephone plan to the lowest possible level in order to save $31. The most powerful man in the Savannah Harbor District was helpless, and that helplessness was something he had chosen for himself, built with his own hands, locked shut, and kept the key to in his own pocket. He had to know. He had left his entire life behind to search for the answer to a question no one had forced him to ask, and he was paying the price for it. Yet the heaviest portion of that price rested not on his shoulders, but on hers. It happened on Wednesday evening, and it began with the framed photograph on the kitchen cabinet. Hale was drying his hands at the sink when Marin walked past, straightened the frame out of habit, then stood there looking at it for another second. Without looking at him, she said that was Brant, her husband. Then she sat down at the table, and that evening she told the story she hadn't told anyone in 2.5 years. She said he had died in a collision on the interstate close to dawn, that the police had called her at 4:15 in the morning, and that for the next 3 days, she had done everything people told her to do without feeling anything at all. Then she told him about the drawer. She said it wasn't until 3 days after the funeral that she found the strength to clear out his desk, and when she opened the bottom drawer to look for the insurance papers, she found a stack of documents fastened together with a staple. She said she sat down on the floor and read every page in about half an hour. A loan agreement. The Sage Hollow property pledged as collateral. His signature at the bottom of every page, clear and steady, signed 2 years before the day he died. She said she couldn't believe it for the first 5 minutes. And after those 5 minutes, she did believe it. And believing was the harder part. She sat at the kitchen table telling the story in the even voice of someone who had repeated it to herself too many times inside her own mind. She said that for the past 2.5 years, she had been living with something she didn't know how to name. She said she loved him. She said she still loved him, truly, because he had been a decent man, because he had never raised his voice to her even once, because apart from her foster mother, he was the only person who had ever chosen her clearly and without hesitation. But she said she resented him too, and that resentment had nowhere to go, because a person couldn't argue with someone who was already beneath the ground. She said every time she tried to be angry, she found herself being angry at a framed photograph, and that made her feel like a terrible person, so she stopped. And then a few months later, the anger returned. She said she had invented every possible reason for him over the past 2 years. Perhaps an investment had failed. Perhaps someone had deceived him. Perhaps he had owed someone money. She said she had even considered the possibility that there had been another woman, and she said it in the calm voice of someone who had looked directly at the worst possibility and survived it. Then she said she didn't know, and she would never know, and that was the part that hurt. She lifted her eyes to him. She said, "I can endure almost anything, Mr. Dorick. I can endure losing my home. I can endure working 14 hours a day. I can endure people saying things about me behind my back. The one thing I can't endure is being the last person to know the truth about my own life." Hale Brannock sat across from her, and he opened his mouth. In that single breath, he fully intended to tell her everything, not half of it, not some careful version that avoided the truth. He intended to tell her everything, right there at that 4-chair table, that very evening, that his name wasn't Dorick but Brannock, that he hadn't come there looking for work, that he had traced the movement of her husband's money and knew where it had gone even though he still didn't know why, that he could pay the entire debt before sunrise if she allowed him. He had drawn breath to speak the first sentence, and the telephone in his pocket vibrated. Not the black telephone beneath the floorboard. It was the inexpensive telephone he kept in his pocket to maintain the role. The number only Gus knew, and that number was used only when something couldn't wait for their 30-minute call during the night. He took it out and looked at the screen. 3 words. Warehouse 4. Fire. Warehouse number 4 stood at the edge of the northern docks, and what was stored inside meant that if it all burned, they wouldn't merely lose merchandise. Hale stood. He told Marin that someone he knew had suddenly fallen ill and been taken to the hospital, that he had to leave that very night, and that he would return as soon as he could. He lied smoothly, without stumbling over a single word, and he heard himself lying even though less than 30 seconds earlier he had been about to tell her everything. Marin asked nothing more. She stood, took the flashlight, and handed it to him because the dirt road was dark, then told him to go, and that they could deal with everything there tomorrow. He walked out to the main road close to 11 o'clock that night, and Gus had a car waiting for him. The trouble at warehouse number 4 continued until nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. The details of that night remained obscured in the shadows of the northern docks, belonged to a world he was trying to leave behind. It is enough to know that the fire hadn't been caused by an electrical fault, that Hale Brannock was there, and that near dawn, everything was settled in the way such matters were always settled. He returned to the nursery a little after 7 o'clock. Maren was in the backyard. She turned and looked at him, and she saw that he was still wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before, but they smelled of smoke. Not the smoke of burning wood, but the smoke of something else burning. And she saw a scrape on the cuff of his sleeve about 2 finger joints long, already dry but still raw along the edges. She asked what had happened to him. Hale said his friend's car had broken down on the way to the hospital, and he had been forced to help fix it along the dark road. Maren looked at him. She didn't ask another question. She nodded, went into the kitchen, poured him a cup of hot coffee, brought it outside and placed it in his hand, then turned away and returned to her work. For the rest of that day, she didn't ask him anything else. She didn't ask how the sick acquaintance was doing. She didn't ask whether he was tired. She didn't ask where the car had broken down, whether it had been near or far, or how long the repair had taken. She worked as usual, spoke as usual about plants and orders, and never returned to the subject of the previous night. Maren Kovalik's silence was never a sign of ignorance. She was silent because she had already understood. That moment would mark the exact turning point around which the rest of their lives would pivot. The first lie, the name Hale Dorick, was a plan. It had been prepared in advance, weighed carefully, and built from an old wound, and it had begun before he ever saw her face. The second lie was different. The second lie came after he had eaten at her table for more than 5 weeks, after she had given him the gloves, after she had sat beside him in the darkness for 40 minutes without asking him anything, and it came less than 10 hours after she had told him that the only thing in this world she couldn't endure was being the last person to know the truth about her own life. The second lie wasn't a plan. It was a choice. And later, when everything had broken apart, and she stood in the garden telling him exactly what she thought of him, the thing she couldn't forgive wouldn't be the name. It took Gus Dravec 9 days to discover what Neil Poacher was afraid of, and when he finally found it, he said there was nothing particularly terrible about it, which was precisely what made it worth mentioning. Poacher hadn't killed anyone, hadn't cheated anyone out of a large sum of money, and hadn't become involved in anything the newspapers would find interesting. He had simply underreported information on 3 consecutive transfer filings to avoid paying a certain tax, and all 3 instances were documented, and those documents were kept somewhere Hale's people could reach. Gus said it was enough to cost Poacher his professional license and possibly send him to court. After listening, Hale told Gus to read him the telephone number. The call took place on Friday evening, lasted less than 4 minutes, and Hale made it from inside the barn using the black telephone, sitting on the folding cot, his voice carrying the same calm tone he used when speaking about the weather. He didn't threaten Poacher. The audience should understand that men like Hale Brannock rarely threatened anyone, because threats were the work of men who weren't certain of their own strength. He merely told Poacher 3 dates, the name of the file, and the drawer where it was being kept. Then he said he wanted Mrs. Kovalik's loan deadline extended by another 90 days. The other end of the line remained silent for about 10 seconds. Then Poacher said, "Yes, sir." He said it in the voice of a man who had just understood whom he was speaking to, though no one had given a name. Hale ended the call and lay down, and that night he slept deeply for the first time in 2 weeks. He believed he had bought Maren 3 months. He believed that during those 3 months, he would find some way to tell her the truth without bringing everything down around them. He had miscalculated, and he had miscalculated for one very simple reason. For 15 years, whenever Hale Brannock spoke such a sentence, the person listening became afraid, and that fear kept them still. Neil Poacher was afraid, but he didn't remain still. He was the kind of man who, when driven into a corner, didn't first think of obeying. He thought of selling the thing that had placed him in that corner. On Saturday afternoon, less than 20 hours after the call, Neil Poacher sold Maren Kovalik's loan. The buyer was the Ferrante family, a name that had stood on the opposite side of Savannah Harbor for nearly 20 years, not powerful enough to drive the Brannocks out, not weak enough to be driven away, and throughout those 20 years, they had searched for an opening in Hale Brannock and never found one. He had no wife, he had no children, he had no brothers or sisters. His parents had been dead for many years. He owned nothing whose loss would cause him pain, had no habit predictable enough to be used against him, and was close to no one who could be turned into leverage. The debt was worth $180,000. The Ferrante family paid Neil Poacher $270,000. They paid nearly $100,000 above its value for a debt owed by someone who had no money, and they paid the entire amount that very afternoon in a single transfer without negotiating. There was no business reason in the world to do such a thing. Gus Dravek called Hale at 10 o'clock on Sunday night, and he didn't read the report in the usual order. His first words were that the woman's debt had just changed hands. He gave Hale the buyer's name. He gave him the purchase price. Then he remained silent for 3 seconds, allowing Hale to complete the calculation. Gus himself had finished 2 hours earlier. Hale sat upright in the darkness of the barn. He asked how long they had known. Gus said he didn't know exactly, but he suspected it had been far longer than either of them had realized. He brought up the strangers who had been asking questions around the harbor several weeks earlier, the matter he had reported, and Hale had told him not to worry about. He said he now understood what those people had been asking for. They hadn't asked where the boss was, because they were looking for the boss. They had asked where the boss was, so they could find out what was valuable wherever he had gone. And Hale, sitting in the darkness, remembered the Sunday morning when the elementary school class came to plant sunflowers, remembered the gray sedan parked beneath the trees along the dirt road, its windows closed, its engine still running, remaining there for exactly 3 minutes before turning around and leaving. He had seen it, he had understood it, and he had done nothing, because doing something would have required him to explain to Marin how a gardener knew how to read a car parked beside the road. Gus spoke the final words of the call in the voice of a 61-year-old man who had worked for Hale for 11 years and had run out of patience. He said that for 15 years, Hale hadn't had a single weakness. Not one. That was why people had left him alone for so long. Now his weakness had an address, a house number, and a white-painted wooden gate, and someone had just bought it for $270,000. Then he asked whether Hale understood what had just happened. Hale didn't answer. He sat for a long time after the call ended, holding the black telephone in his hand and listening to the insects in the garden through the gaps between the boards. 30 meters away, inside the main house, the lights had been out for some time, and Marin Kovalik was asleep. She had slept more peacefully over the past few nights because a letter had arrived on Tuesday morning informing her that the deadline had been extended by 90 days, and she had read the letter twice, smiled, and told him that perhaps there were still decent people in the world. She didn't know who had done it. She didn't know that the letter had traded the safety of her life for 3 months of additional time. Hale Brannock came to Sage Hollow to discover whether anyone could care for him when he had nothing. He had stayed for 5 weeks, eaten rice with beans and eggs, accepted the gloves of a dead man, and been defended in the middle of an agricultural supply store by a poor woman. Then, because he couldn't bear to watch her reduce her telephone plan to save $31, he reached out once, only once, and used the power he had tried to put away. That single act was what turned the woman into a target. Had Hale Brannock never walked through that gate, Marin Kovalik would still rise at 6 o'clock the following morning. She would still be poor, still owe $180,000, and still have no idea how she was going to survive. But she would be safe. And now she wasn't safe anymore. Augustine Dravek drove to Sage Hollow on Tuesday morning, alone, in his own old car, rather than one belonging to the organization. He didn't call Hale in advance. He had worked for the Brannock family for 11 years, and in all those years, he had never once acted against his boss's wishes. And that morning, as he drove, he knew exactly what he was doing. He waited until he saw the old pickup truck leave the nursery, before turning into the drive. Hale was working in the western field, nearly 400 meters from the main house, and saw nothing. Marin opened the door. She looked at the older man standing on the porch, his hair gray, wearing a cloth jacket, holding nothing but a newspaper folded in half. He introduced himself, said he wasn't selling anything, and asked for 3 minutes of her time. There was something in the way he stood that made her open the door and allow him inside, and later, she would think about that for a very long time. He didn't walk far into the kitchen. He stood at the head of the table, unfolded the newspaper, spread it flat across the wood, and turned it so she could read it. It was a local newspaper from 3 years earlier, already yellowed with age, open to an inside page. Half the page was taken up by a photograph from the opening ceremony of a new pier at the harbor. Several men in suits stood cutting a ribbon, and among them was a state senator Marin had seen on television. And at the far left edge of the photograph, standing some distance from the crowd, was a man in a white shirt leaning against the wall behind them, neither smiling nor looking toward the camera. The caption beneath the photograph was 3 lines long, and within those 3 lines was a name. Maren looked at the picture. She said nothing. Gus Dravek spoke, and he spoke briefly, like a man who had prepared every word during the entire drive there. He said, "Miss Kovalik, I didn't come here to harm you. I didn't come here to defend anyone either." He said someone had just purchased her debt, that they had paid nearly $100,000 more than its true value, and that they hadn't bought it for the money. He said she was standing in the middle of something she had never chosen, and didn't even know when she had stepped into. Then he said the final sentence. He said, "I believe a woman has the right to know where she is standing." Maren asked him only one question. She asked what he was to the man in the photograph. Gus said he had worked for him for 11 years. Then he nodded to her, walked toward the door, and before stepping down from the porch, he turned back and added that he wouldn't tell Hale he had come there, and whether she chose to say anything was entirely up to her. He got into his car and left. He left the newspaper on the table. Maren Kovalik sat down in her chair at the 4-chair table, and she remained there for a very long time. She didn't cry. She didn't rise and go outside to water the plants. This time, she sat still and allowed everything inside her mind to arrange itself into place. The night someone entered the nursery. The man standing in the middle of the yard at 2 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by fallen plastic pots, empty-handed, breathing evenly, telling her they were gone, and that he would repair the fence in the morning, using the same voice he used when speaking about the weather. She had asked whether he was afraid. He had said no. The following morning, he repaired the fence, then walked slowly along all 4 sides of the property. His eyes lowered toward the bases of the posts, stopping at the 2 places where someone standing on the road could see directly into the backyard, taking nearly 40 minutes to complete the circuit without pulling a single weed. She had stood on the porch and watched him make that entire round, the coffee cooling in her hand, and she had put the memory somewhere inside her mind without giving it a name. Now it had one. The faint blue light shining through the crack of the barn door at 1 o'clock in the morning, his shadow moving across the wall when he shifted where he sat. She had told herself a story about a man with an elderly mother in Charleston, someone who was ill, money that had to be sent home. She had carried bread and coffee outside and left them on the barn step for that story. The smell of smoke on his clothes that morning, not the smell of burning wood, the scrape on his wrist. The car had broken down on the road, he had said, and he had been forced to crawl underneath it to make the repair. She had nodded, poured him coffee, and hadn't asked another question for the rest of that day. And the afternoon at the agricultural supply store, 2 well-dressed men had made a remark about the kind of stray the Kovalik girl had brought home, and they had laughed the short laugh of men who believed they had said something harmless. She had stepped forward and spoken for him. She had told them to keep their opinions behind their teeth. And sitting at the kitchen table that Tuesday morning, she remembered that before she had managed to open her mouth, there had been a moment when the man beside her lifted his eyes toward those 2 men, and both of them had fallen silent. She remembered it. At the time, she hadn't noticed because she had been angry. Now she remembered, and she sat looking at the photograph in the newspaper, at the man in the white shirt leaning against the wall, standing apart from the crowd, not smiling. She had spoken that very name aloud on the first morning, standing beside the hydrangea bed, when she told him that if he needed proper wages, he should go down to the harbor and ask for work, because people said the Brannock companies paid generously. The man who brought down Hale Brannock's disguise wasn't a traitor. Augustine Dravek hadn't sold his boss to anyone, hadn't taken a single dollar, hadn't gained anything from what he did, and he knew perfectly well that if Hale wished it, his 11 years of service could end before the week was over. He did it because he was 61 years old, because he had watched a woman being drawn into something she had never chosen, and because he couldn't bear to let her remain inside it without knowing. He was the most decent man in that entire organization, and that morning, he did the most decent thing he knew how to do. When everything fell apart, Hale Brannock would have no one to blame. He couldn't blame Gus. He couldn't blame the Ferrante family. He couldn't blame Neil Poacher. There would be only one person left, and that person was working in the western field, wearing the gloves of a dead man, tying up the climbing trellis, and knowing nothing at all. Hale reached the backyard close to noon, still wearing the gloves, and he knew something was wrong before he even saw her face. Maren was standing on the porch. She wasn't doing anything at all. In the 2 months he had been there, he had never once seen her standing idle in the middle of the day. She told him to come inside for a moment, her voice ordinary. He took off the gloves, climbed the porch steps, entered the kitchen, and saw the newspaper spread across the table, opened to the inside page and turned toward the chair where he always sat. He didn't need more than a second. He knew that photograph. He even remembered the morning it had been taken. Hale stood still. Marin didn't scream. Her voice was very quiet, because if she had screamed, everything would have been much easier for him. Her voice was very quiet, quieter than usual, and it was calm in the way a person sounds when holding something tightly inside her chest with both hands. She said, "Brannock." Then she said it again, more slowly. "Not some Brannock. The Brannock." He said yes. She asked how long. He said from the beginning, from that first morning at the gate. Marin nodded, a very small nod, like someone who had just received confirmation of something she already knew but had still hoped was wrong. Then she began to speak, and she didn't speak quickly or stumble over her words. She spoke one sentence at a time, as though she had been arranging them for the past 2 hours while sitting at that table. She said, "You slept in my barn." She said, "You ate eggs 3 nights in a row because I didn't have enough money to buy meat for 2 people, and I pushed the last piece of meat onto your plate, and you ate it." She said, "I reduced my telephone plan to the lowest level to save $31 a month, and you stood outside on the porch and listened to the entire call." She said, "I climbed a utility pole at the end of the road to post a notice selling my tiller, and you stood below holding the ladder for me." Then her voice fell even lower. She said, "You took the gloves that belonged to someone in my family because I believed you couldn't afford a pair of gloves to prune roses." She said, "And you own that entire harbor." Hale said nothing. There was nothing he could say. Then she spoke the words he had known were coming, and they still struck harder than he had imagined. She said, "I told you the thing I hate most in this world. Right here at this table. Do you remember?" She said, "I told you I could endure almost anything, but I couldn't endure being the last person to know the truth about my own life." She said, "I told you that, and I meant every word, and that night you stood up and left at 11 o'clock, and the next morning you came back with smoke on your clothes and a tear at your wrist, and you told me the car had broken down." She said, "You looked directly into my face and told me the car had broken down." She fell silent for a moment. Then she said, "I gave you coffee." The silence that followed was heavier than any words she had spoken. Hale Brannock stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking at the woman he had hurt, and finally began to speak. He told her everything. He told her about Corinne Vess, about that afternoon 7 years earlier, about the door left open the width of a hand and the light, cheerful voice saying that a woman could endure a great many things in exchange for a house whose door no one would ever dare knock on. He told her how he hadn't pushed the door open, hadn't asked a single question, and how 3 days later there had been no engagement party. He told her about the long table with 12 chairs in the great house, about 7 years of eating dinner alone at the head of that table with a servant waiting near the kitchen door, about the nights when he finished eating in 12 minutes, and the nights when he merely sat there. He told her that in 15 years, no one had ever spoken a word to him without some price lying beneath it. Then he told her about the morning at the River Street Market 3 months earlier, about the crowd parting before him, about the fruit seller pressing a bag of oranges into his hands with trembling fingers, and about the woman at the flower stall, at the end of the row, who had looked up at him for exactly 1 second before lowering her eyes and tying the rosemary again. He said, "You were the only person in this entire city who looked at me and didn't see a wall to hide behind. You looked at me and saw nothing you needed. Do you know what that is worth to a man like me?" He said, "I had to know whether there was still anyone in this world who could care for this man when he held nothing in his hands, because the man who had everything had never once been cared for." He said, "That is why I lied to you. It was the most cowardly way to search for something I should have asked for honestly, and it was wrong, and there are no words of apology large enough." Marin listened from beginning to end. She stood with her arms crossed, leaning against the edge of the table, and she didn't interrupt him once. When he finished, she remained silent for a long time. Then she said, "I understand why you did it." She meant it, and that was what made it hurt. Then she said, "That doesn't make it right." She said, "You allowed me to pity you. You allowed me to give from the little I had, day after day, and you accepted all of it." She said, "My dignity is almost the only thing I have left in this world, Mr. Brannock, and you just spent 3 months of it." Then she said, "Leave the gloves on the porch step, then get off my land." Hale Brannock did exactly that. He walked out onto the porch, placed the worn leather gloves on the wooden step, folded them neatly, then stood upright. He didn't turn back and ask her to hear another word. He didn't make any promises. He didn't say he would repair everything. Throughout that entire afternoon, from the moment he entered the kitchen and saw the newspaper until the moment he placed the gloves on the porch step, the most powerful man in the Savannah Harbor District stood inside the home of a woman who was about to lose everything, knowing that one sentence from him could change the direction of it all, and he didn't speak that sentence. He didn't say he would pay the debt. He didn't say he could buy the entire property across the road for her. He didn't say, "Forgive me, and I will provide for you for the rest of your life." He didn't place a single dollar on the scale, because placing money on the scale in that moment would have meant admitting that he still believed something could be bought, and if he still believed that, then he had understood nothing about the past 2 months. He simply accepted what he had done wrong, accepted all of it without conditions, and asked for nothing in return. Then he walked toward the gate, past the hydrangea bed, through the white-painted wooden gate, and out onto the dirt road, exactly as he had walked in 2 months earlier. During those 19 days, almost everything unfolded while he was gone. On the second day, the telephone in Marin's house rang in the middle of the afternoon. The caller introduced himself by a name she couldn't remember afterward, spoke politely in a pleasant voice, and said that his party now held her loan. He said they understood her circumstances, that she was carrying a debt she had never created, and that there was a way for the matter to end well for her. He said the entire $180,000 would be erased, not postponed, not divided into installments, erased completely, with the papers signed that very week. Marin asked what they wanted in return. He said she only needed to sign a statement. She had lived on the same property as a man for 2 months. She knew when he came and went. She knew there had been nights when he was absent, and she remembered the morning he returned with smoke on his clothes. He said she only needed to write down what she had seen, exactly as she had seen it, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. He emphasized that part. "You won't need to tell a single lie, ma'am, only the truth." She was 27 years old. She had a little more than 20 days before she lost the last piece of land her foster mother had left her. She had just discovered that the man she had fed at her table for 2 months had lied to her from his very first sentence. She had given him the gloves that belonged to someone in her family. She had pushed the last piece of meat onto his plate. She had defended him in the middle of an agricultural supply store against 2 men she had despised all her life. And now someone was offering to erase everything in exchange for her writing down things she had truly witnessed with her own eyes. No court in the world would have condemned her if she had said yes. Marin remained silent for about 5 seconds. Then she said, "He lied to me. I haven't forgiven him for that, and perhaps I never will. But he never harmed me, not once. He repaired my fence. He fixed an irrigation system that had been broken for 10 months. He ate eggs 3 nights in a row and never complained." She said, "I know the difference between those things, sir." Then she said, "And you people are trying to harm me while smiling at me over the telephone, and I know the difference there too. Don't call again." She hung up. Then she went out into the garden and finished watering the last 2 beds, because that was how she dealt with everything in her life. On the 9th day, Ottilie Rausch knocked on her door at 7 o'clock in the morning carrying a folder of documents. She had gone to the bank 3 times that week. She had mortgaged the small, pale blue wooden house where she had lived for 40 years in order to take out a loan, and she offered to buy the 3 eastern acres of Sage Hollow at full market value, without reducing the price by a single dollar, supported by an independent appraisal. Marin said no, that Ottilie couldn't do such a thing. Ottilie said, "I'm 66 years old. I need more land for my beehives, and don't you tell me what I can and can't do." Then she placed the prepared contract on the table, and inside it was a clause she had insisted upon, stating that those 3 acres could never be converted to another use, that they were a garden and would remain a garden forever. The money paid 2/3 of the debt. For the remaining third, Marin got into her pickup truck, drove into the city, sat across from the attorney representing the new creditor, and negotiated a monthly payment schedule secured by the nursery's revenue. It was the wisest step she could have taken. She couldn't erase the debt. There was no way for her to erase it. But no one could foreclose on collateral securing a debt that was being paid on time, no matter how badly they wanted to, no matter that they had paid nearly $100,000 above its true value to acquire it. The Ferrante family was forced to sign. They had spent $270,000 to buy a gun, and the woman had quietly removed every bullet from it. On the 14th day, elsewhere in the city, Hale Brannock sat down at a table with the Ferrante family and did something no one had imagined he would ever do in 15 years. He surrendered control of the 2 northern docks. Those docks were what he had built when he was 19 years old. They had been his first foothold in the harbor, the reason no one had dared move against him for 15 years. He gave them to his rivals in exchange for one condition alone: that the name Sage Hollow and the woman named Marin Kovalik would forever remain outside every matter between the 2 families. He signed, stood, and left. He didn't say a word to her. He ordered Gus not to tell her. He spent those 18 days watching Sage Hollow from the rise of the hill a mile away, ensuring no stranger approached her gate again, while remaining in the shadows as he had promised. 3 days later, Augustine Dravek drove to the nursery and parked outside the gate for the second time. He didn't enter the house. He stood beside the white-painted wooden gate and told Marin about the 2 docks. He told the story briefly, without embellishment, and without defending anyone. He also told her that Hale himself had forced Neil Poacher to extend her deadline, and that this very act had caused her loan to be sold to the Ferrante family, which meant that the greatest danger she had ever faced had been created by Hale while he was trying to help her. He told her both things, the good and the bad, and allowed her to weigh them for herself. Then he turned toward his car. Before opening the door, he looked back and added one sentence. He said, "He told me not to tell you. I'm 61 years old, Miss Kovalik. I don't take orders from anyone anymore." Then he drove away. Gus was also the one who told Hale about the telephone call on the second day. He told him one evening in the great house, while Hale sat at the long table with 12 chairs and an untouched plate before him. He said the Ferrante family had called the woman and offered to erase her entire debt, and that she had refused, and he repeated almost word for word what she had said over the telephone. Hale Brannock remained silent for a very long time after Gus finished. Sitting at the table with 12 chairs that night, Hale Brannock felt the ground crumble beneath his long-held convictions. He had given 2 months of his life to searching for the answer to a question. He had borrowed a name, slept in a barn, eaten rice with beans and eggs, and allowed a poor woman to feed him from the little she possessed, all to discover whether anyone could care for him when he had nothing. And the answer had been given on the second day after he left, through a telephone call he knew nothing about, by a woman he had just deceived, who was about to lose her home and had every reason in the world to push him down. She had answered his question at the very moment he wasn't there to hear it, when there was nothing left to gain, no one left to please, and when she knew exactly who he was. It was the purest answer one human being could give another in this world. And sitting at the table with 12 chairs that night, Hale Brannock finally understood what he had gotten wrong from the first morning he stood at her gate. He had never needed a test at all. He had only needed enough courage to walk forward and ask her honestly. The gloves remained on the wooden porch step for 18 days. Marin passed them every morning at 6 o'clock and every evening after dark. And for 18 straight days she didn't pick them up. Not because she had forgotten, but because every time she saw them, she saw the 2 hands that had placed them there, then straightened and walked away without looking back. On the 18th day, after seeing Audley home, she bent down, picked them up, and carried them inside to put them away in the drawer. A long section of stitching in the lining of the right glove had come loose some time before, perhaps while Hale had still been wearing it, and when she turned the glove upside down to fold it neatly, the lining flipped outward. Inside, along the inner edge of the cuff, were 2 initials embroidered by hand in thread whose color had almost completely faded. D.W. Marin stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen for a very long time. Her husband's name had been Brant Whitlow. His first initial was B. She turned the other glove inside out and searched, and in the exact same place were the same 2 letters, sewn in the same hand with the same color thread. D. W. Delphine Ward. 2.5 years earlier, after her husband's funeral, she had cleared the house in the numb condition of someone who could no longer feel anything, and she had gathered belongings into drawers without examining them closely. The gloves had been in the drawer with the dead man's other possessions, and she had assumed they belonged to him. She had never checked again. People didn't go back and examine things they believed they had already finished grieving. But those gloves had belonged to the woman who took her in when she was 14 years old, the woman who taught her how to stake branches, how to read what soil lacked by the color of a leaf, the woman who left her this nursery and the habit of rising at 6 o'clock every morning. They were her gardening gloves, worn into the shape of her hands, and Marin had given them to a stranger while believing she was giving away something else. She carried the gloves 300 meters to Ottilie Rausch's house and placed them on the kitchen table that smelled of beeswax. She asked whether Ottilie recognized them. Ottilie looked at the gloves, and her face changed. She picked them up, turned the lining outward, touched the embroidered initials, then set them down again. She sat in silence for a while. Then she said, "I mortgaged my house for you 9 days ago. I believe that gives me the right to stop keeping a dead man's secret." Then she told her. She told the entire story once, from beginning to end, without stopping halfway through, and this was the only time in the whole story that the truth was spoken aloud. She said Delphine had fallen ill that spring, and it wasn't the kind of illness that could be treated in a few months and then forgotten. The final 18 months of her life were 18 months of hospitals, medicine, transfers to other facilities, and then more hospitals. Insurance covered only a very small portion. She said, "You didn't know because you were running back and forth between the hospital and the nursery, sleeping 4 hours a night, and every time you asked how the medical bills were being paid, your mother told you that a church charity was helping." She said there had never been any charity. She said Brandt had come to her one evening and sat in the very chair Marin was sitting in now. He told her he had worked everything out. He would borrow from the bank, use the nursery as collateral, withdraw the money month by month according to the exact amount of each medical bill, and have Ottilie receive it in her name before sending it directly to the hospital. He said he didn't want his own name appearing on any payment document there. Ottilie said she had asked him why. Why would he need to hide something like that from his own wife? Then she repeated the answer he had given. The answer she had carried inside herself for 2.5 years. He had said, Marin would never accept it. She would insist on selling the nursery the very next day. She would sell it, and she would say she didn't regret it, and then she would live with it for the rest of her life. I don't want her to have to choose between her mother and her mother's garden. No one should ever be forced to choose between two things like that. Ottilie said he had planned to work extra hours and repay the loan little by little, and that he had already paid back some of it during those 2 years, and that he intended to tell Marin when the balance was nearly gone. Then, he died on the interstate close to dawn, and never had the chance to tell anyone. She said, I intended to carry this secret to my grave. I promised him I would. But 9 days ago, I placed my own house at risk for you, and I decided that a promise made to a dead man doesn't weigh more than allowing a living woman to misunderstand her husband for 2.5 years. Marin Kovalek sat in that kitchen filled with the scent of beeswax, and couldn't speak for a very long time. In the course of one afternoon, 3 things she had believed lost were returned to her. She was given back her husband, the man she had both loved and resented for 2.5 years without anywhere to lay that resentment down, and now she knew the loan papers in the bottom drawer hadn't been evidence of betrayal. They had been the bill for the final 18 months of her mother's life, and he had signed them without telling anyone so that she would never have to choose. She was given back her foster mother, the woman who was still present in the thing Marin now held in her hands, the shape of her palm still preserved in the worn leather, and she understood the third thing, the thing that made her rise and walk out onto the porch to stand alone. On the evening, she had placed the gloves on the table and pushed them toward a poorly dressed gardener, saying they weren't helping anyone sitting in a drawer. What she had passed across the table hadn't been an old pair of gloves. It had been the only 2 people in the world who had ever chosen her, and Marin Kovalek had given away the most precious thing in her life without even knowing it, and Hale Brannick had held it in his hands, worn it while pruning roses for 2 months, placed it on the wooden porch step, and walked away without ever knowing what he had received. Some gifts in this world are like that. Their true shape isn't revealed until long after they have been given, and often, something has to break before anyone can finally see them. On the morning of the 19th day, a black Rolls-Royce Phantom turned onto the dirt road leading to Sage Hollow. In all the 40 years that road had existed, it had never seen a car like that. It was a dirt road bordered by wooden fences and wild grass, and the vehicles that traveled it were old pickup trucks delivering fertilizer, and the yellow school bus that brought children to plant sunflowers once a month. The Phantom moved slowly, its tires raising no dust, because the driver knew how to travel such a road without stirring it, and by the time it stopped in front of the white-painted wooden gate, nearly half the street had come out onto their porches to watch. Ottilie Rausch was standing at her own fence 300 meters away, still holding the bucket she used to feed the bees. The car door opened. The man who stepped out was wearing the faded flannel shirt and the boots still marked with dried mud. The same shirt and the same boots he had worn that first morning 2 months earlier. Marin was standing in the middle of the hydrangea bed. She straightened and didn't come forward. Hale Brannock pushed open the gate, walked inside, and stopped about 3 steps from her, at the exact distance where he had stopped on the first morning when he asked her for work. He said, "I came in that car so you could see clearly and exactly who is standing before you. Nothing hidden anymore, no half-name, nothing left for you to guess." Then he said, "But I wore this shirt because the man asking you today is the one who slept in that barn and ate at that kitchen table, not the man in the newspaper photograph." He continued, speaking slowly, one sentence at a time. He said, "You paid your debt yourself. I know how you did it, and I know what Ottilie did. I didn't touch a single dollar of it, and I never will." He said, "I haven't brought anything here to exchange for your answer. There are no papers in the car. No one is waiting out on the road. If you tell me to leave today, I will leave, and everything that belongs to you will remain exactly as it is." Then he said, "I am asking honestly. For the first time in my life, I am asking someone a question like this, without hiding anything behind my back. Will you marry this man?" Maren stood still for a long time. She looked at him, looked at the car outside the gate, looked at the flannel shirt, then looked back at him. Then she said, "I have only one question." She said, "If I answer no, will you call someone tomorrow?" Hale said no. She asked, "How can I believe you?" And that man, whom no one had dared question that way in 15 years, said, "You can't." He said, "That is exactly where I stood for 7 years. There is no way to know with certainty whether someone is genuine with you or not. I gave 2 months of my life trying to find a way, and I was wrong, and I hurt you because of that mistake. Now I am standing in that same place for you. You have no guarantee except to look at me and decide for yourself." Maren said nothing. She turned and went into the house. Hale remained standing among the hydrangeas, not knowing what was happening, and he didn't follow her. In the kitchen, Maren opened the drawer and took out the worn leather gloves, the lining inside still split along one seam. She carried them onto the porch, walked down into the yard, and placed them in his hands. Hale Brannock held the gloves and believed she had forgiven him. He didn't know what he had just been given. He didn't know that inside the loosened lining were 2 faded initials embroidered by hand, and he didn't know that the woman standing before him had just placed in his hands the only 2 people in the world who had ever chosen her: the foster mother who had taken her in when she was 14, and the husband who had signed a loan agreement, so she wouldn't have to choose between her mother and her mother's garden. He would learn that truth one evening much later. When she told him, and when she did, he would have to sit down. But for now, he simply stood there holding the gloves. Maren said, "Come inside, Mr. Brannock. You know the rule. Here, I set enough plates." And that, in Maren Kovalik's way, was a yes. They married that autumn in the middle of the nursery, beneath 2 rows of trees they had replanted together during the summer. There were 28 guests. Ottilie Rausch sat in the front row wearing the dress she reserved for church, and she cried from beginning to end without trying to hide it from anyone. Augustine Drevek stood at the far end of the yard with his back against the barn wall, following the habit of 11 years, and he cried too, but he chose a place where no one saw him in time, and by the time anyone turned toward him, his face was dry. The long table with 12 chairs from the great house was given to a church on the western side of the city, where people needed a long table to serve meals to those who had nowhere to eat dinner. Hale didn't keep a single chair. From then on, the 2 of them ate dinner at the Sage Hollow kitchen table, the 4-chair wooden table pushed against the wall, and there were always enough plates upon it. The 48 suits hanging in the closet of the great house were almost never touched. Hale still wore the old gloves when he trimmed the hedges every Saturday morning, and he never bought another pair, even after they became so worn that they could only be used for light work. The 3 eastern acres remained in Ottilie's name, filled with flowers and beehives, and the contract still carried the sentence she had insisted upon, that this land was a garden and would remain a garden forever. He remembered Corinne Vess and the words spoken through a partly open door. For 7 years, that had been the truest thing Hale Brannock believed about himself. He believed he was a wall, with a man attached to it, and that the man was the part no one needed. He had built a name that made an entire city lower its voice, and that name stood between him and everyone he met, so thick that he could no longer see anyone through it. It took a woman who owed $180,000, who ate rice with beans and eggs, and who refused to let a stranger carry his plate outside and eat alone, to silence that voice inside his head. Because there is a difference between being feared and being loved. between being valued for what one possesses and being needed for who one is. A person can spend an entire lifetime surrounded by the first and still die starving for the second, and money can buy many things, but it has never bought that. A person's dignity doesn't lie in what they possess. It lies in what they are willing to give when they themselves have almost nothing left. Hale Brannock had eaten dinner alone for 7 years in a house whose door no one dared knock on. Until the evening, a woman in debt called him back in the middle of her kitchen and spoke words worth more than everything he owned. "Here, I set enough plates. Sit down." And from that day forward, in the small house at the end of that dirt road, no one ever had to eat alone again. If you have ever wondered whether people love you for who you are or for what you hold in your hands, leave a like for this story. Share it with someone you believe would remain beside you even if you had nothing left. And subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Marin and Hale's story? Do you think she should have forgiven him? And have you ever met someone willing to give when they themselves had very little left? Leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. May everyone watching this video always enjoy good health, happiness, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.